morning, sun. How are you? Skies above. Gee, it's great to be alive and love. Good, good, good morning, sun. Good, good, good morning. Good, good morning. Good morning, sun. How are you? Skies above. Gee, it's great to be alive and love. Good, good, good morning, sun.
And hello and good afternoon, evening, morning. Is this working? Yes, it is. Okay, great. So today I wanted to share something I saw on a forum or a forum-like discussion about Business Central. And where are we? It relates to restoring data from a broken Docker container. And I know there will be cautionary tales around this, but there is some background. So when it comes to storing data in Business Central Docker containers, unless there's some edge case I'm not aware of, my understanding is the general recommendation is to not do it. I consider Business Central Docker containers to be disposable. And anything I do with them or any data I put into them, any configuration I have in my Business Central Docker containers for testing or dev or QA or whatever, that is completely disposable, and I should expect to lose anything I do with that container. And I set that up for myself using scripts. So every morning I have a script, a PowerShell script that runs. It wipes out my containers and rebuilds them fresh with the latest version. So that's kind of how I force myself from putting anything in my container that I want. So the recommendation is don't store any valuable data in your BC Docker container. And that kind of extends to configuration. You don't want to spend 8 hours setting up all sorts of configuration in a Business Central Docker container for the reason that I'll show you. As I mentioned, I refresh my containers every morning to strongly discourage me from using them as any type of data or configuration storage. And one potential workaround for this is to point your containers to a local SQL instance. I've never had the need to really do that. I would prefer to not do that. But my understanding is it's technically possible. Say you restore a customer's database to your local SQL instance, you can point a container to that. I don't want to deal with hosting that. I don't want to deal with version management upgrades. It's just more than I want to take on at this point. But my understanding is that is possible. And another approach, if you do happen to put data in a Business Central container, you can back it up with a BC container helper command backup-BC container databases. Apparently that is an option. Again, I've never used it just because I don't want to be reliant upon the container version, the state, or anything like that. I'd rather have an approach where I script out the configuration or data I need and apply that to a fresh container that is not version dependent, etc. So that's the concept. And like I said, there are probably details and edge cases and different variants of how to deal with that. But that's my philosophy. But what if mistakes were made? And what if you started by just temporarily creating some test data, just a few tests, right? I just need to test this now. And I'll follow up with it tomorrow. And then over time, that container just gets more and more test data, more and more configuration. Or maybe you enter a bunch of test data and you don't think about it for several months. But then all of a sudden, you realize, oh, we need that container. It's got our configuration. It's got the test data. It has whatever is in there that you want to reproduce or you don't want to have to recreate. Suddenly, that old container becomes valuable. But when you go to start the container after 3 months or whatever, it won't start. And one clear example of this is Windows updates. The container was created on this version of Business Central with this version of Windows. When Windows got updated automatically by Windows Update, that Business Central container will no longer start. You have a Windows version mismatch, you have all sorts of Docker issues. Any number of scenarios could potentially cause an issue with that container, and it just won't start. Updating Docker, people have had this experience. Docker on Windows 10, after they update, their containers just break and they can't get them restarted. So it's not an uncommon scenario. What should be uncommon is the reliance upon the data in that container. But it's not uncommon for containers to break, so should be a cautionary tale there. So what do? You have stuff in a container, you still have the container, but you can't start it up. Because you can't start it up, you can't perform the BC container helper command to back up those SQL databases. So what do? Well, there is an interesting workaround, and we'll call this the alternative container database restore method. And this is not my idea at all. I just saw the post on a Yammer forum and decided to dig into it and just document it because the person who encountered this problem can't possibly be alone. There are other people who are going to make this mistake. So while I don't recommend this approach, it is a last resort and it should work in theory. So the idea is that if the container is intact, even if it won't start, you should be able to copy the SQL database files, the MDF and LDF files from the container to your local file system. Once you get those SQL files off of the container, you should then be able to copy those MDF and LDF files into a working container. Now, probably several caveats, one of which is likely the Business Central container version. Now, you can get the version of that container even if it doesn't start up, and you should be able to create a new container and reference that older image, hopefully. That's the idea, at least. So if you have a working container with the same Business Central version, and you can copy those MDF and LDF files into that container, in theory, you should be able to start up that container and have your data back. So this is the process. You're going to make sure that both of your containers are stopped. Now, your broken container, it shouldn't be able to start, so it should be stopped. Your working container, you will need to stop, and then you'll run a few commands. And in my example, I always have two containers. One is called dev18, one is called test18. And for this simulation, dev18 is going to be my broken container that has my data. Test18 is going to be my working container that does not have the data I want. So I'm going to grab the database files from dev18, copy them to test18, and turn on test18 and see if it restores my data. So let's give this a try. Okay, so here we are on my Docker server, and let me just refresh this to make sure BC doesn't time out on me. So you will see here that this is my dev18 container, and I have a customer here called dev18 customer with all of my favorite food groups represented here. We've got pizza, burger, fries, hot dog, and bacon. And so this is my fast food customer, shall we say. Now, in my test18 container, I do not have that customer at all. I just have the default Cronus customers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the idea is that this C10 customer, dev18 customer, this is the data that I need, and we're going to shut down this container, and I need to get it into my test18 container, which I just freshly set up. It works perfectly, and it is the exact same version. Dev 18 and test 18 are the exact same version of Business Central. Okay, so let's go over here. I'm going to stop my dev 18 container because it's the one that is broken, right? So I'm going to type docker stop dev 18 and it has stopped. And if we go over to my dev 18 browser tab, it's unresponsive and it should time out. It should time out. So yeah, it's just spinning here and it's dead. So if I do docker ps-a, we see that my dev 18 container has exited right behind my head there. It has exited. So it is not running and the site cannot be reached. Okay, so now that we've stopped that container, I'm going to also stop my test 18 container because in order to copy my database files into that container, I'm going to want to stop it. And again, just takes a few seconds. Okay, so now test 18 is stopped as well. So now I have two stop containers. Test 18, dev 18 both exited. Okay. So now I'm going to run this command and let's scoot this over here, make it bigger. Bigger. Okay, so what are these commands? So this is a command called docker container cp. And this seems to be equivalent, from what I could tell, of a command called docker cp. So I don't know if they're exactly the same, but as far as I could tell from the Docker documentation, Docker container CP and Docker CP are effectively the same. I wasn't able to find any difference between the two, but the person who posted this solution showed the example of Docker container CP, so I'm just going to use that one. Okay, so the command is docker container CP. That says on this Docker container, copy files to or from that container. And when you copy, you'll want to reference the container ID. So how do you get that? Let's go back to our PowerShell here. And I'm going to type, oh, I already have it here. So we have docker PSA, and my dev 18 container has a container ID of FD ending in F36. So that's where this hexadecimal value is coming from. Now on this container, I'll have a colon, and then you reference the local path on that container. And apparently, I just learned this today, on the Docker containers, the SQL database files, the MDF and LDF files, are stored in C:\databases, plural. And we'll take a look at this later. But I said, okay, cool. So now we have C databases. Now, we're telling Docker container CP to copy files from the databases directory, or is in this case technically copy the entire databases directory, to our local file system. And in this case, I set up a directory on my D drive. Hopefully I did that right. Called BC Docker Backups and Dev 18. So I'm going to put my backups in Dev 18. Let me just clear that out. Okay, that's where my database files are going to go. So Docker container CP, container ID, colon, container local path, C:\databases, and copy to my local file system on the D drive into this directory. So let's give this a try. Let's copy this command, paste that in. Now, you can use relative references here so that you don't have to be in this directory, but I tried that and it can get kind of confusing. If you're not in the right directory, if there's a subdirectory that you didn't expect, it won't work. So I would personally recommend using the absolute path, the full path names for both the Docker container directory and your local directory, just to avoid any confusion or accident. I tried this 3 or 4 times before I realized I was having a pathing issue. So I went to absolute pass, and that helped. Okay, so now if we go over to my D drive here, we now see that we have a databases folder. And within databases, we see I have Cronus, Default, and Navision, LDF, and MDF database files. And if you're familiar with SQL Server, what we're effectively doing is we're stopping the SQL Server instance, similar to, say, stopping the Windows service for SQL Server. We've stopped the container, so it's effectively stopping the SQL Server service. We're then copying the MDF and LDF files out, and we're going to move them over to our other container and start things back up. It's similar to a detach attach, but it's just kind of the low-tech, probably not recommended way of doing things, but it works. I've done it plenty of times with SQL Server. So now that we have these files locally, let's push them over to the test18 container. To do that, we have a command very similar, docker container cp, but now we're pointing to our local database files. And note that I have my path, dbc docker backups dev18 databases /period. This took me several tries to figure out, because if you don't have that /period at the end, it will move the entire databases directory from your local system, local file system, to your container, and it just doesn't work well. So within my databases directory here, I want to copy all of these files, and that's what the /period does, apparently. I want to copy them to my test18 container ID, which is this E8D ending in E78, :C:\databases. Now you could probably have a few different syntax variations on how you do this, but this works, so this is what I'm going to go with. So I'm now going to copy this, paste it in here. So this is copying the files from my local file system to my test18 Docker container. Okay, and hit enter. And there we go. Now our files are copied. Now we can start up our test18 container. So docker start test18. Okay. Now while that's starting up, there is a technique, in case you're having any issues and this isn't working for you, that I had many issues. The technique that I used to figure out what I was doing wrong is to use this icon. So when you create your Docker container using BC Container Helper, like here, there is a parameter called shortcuts. Now I normally have shortcuts none because I don't use them often, but I had to recreate my test18 container without this shortcuts none, so that shortcuts were created on the desktop. And that gave me this test18 command prompt. And what's super cool about this is you just launch it and you can see the command prompt from within that Docker container. So here I have my C drive on the Docker container. I'm going to go to databases, CD databases, and I'm going to do a directory. Now here you will see your MDF and LDF SQL files. And the problem I had was my entire databases directory was being copied to the Docker container as a subdirectory here. It wasn't just copying the files, it was moving the whole directory. And within databases, I had databases again. I was like, wait, what? And so I had to figure out how to get just the files from my databases directory transferred to this databases directory. And in order to do that, that did involve that /period. And Eric notes that a period is typically the same as star. And yes, I tried star. That did not work here. It did not like that syntax. So something about the Docker CP, you need to have the /period. Now, like I said, you could have a different syntax that does exactly the same thing. This is just the one that I found worked for me. So if you are having issues and this restore is not working, try opening up the test 18 or your Docker container command prompt, navigate to C databases on that container and look at these. And so I was able to look at the file timestamps and see whether or not the files were copied successfully and whether or not I had that databases subdirectory. And I repeatedly had to delete that and keep trying till I figured out the correct syntax. So now that I have essentially overwritten the LDF and MDF files on my test 18 container and restarted it, let's go back to test 18. Let's log back in. And now previously we only had customers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So fingers crossed this worked. I did this about 10 times before I got it to work. So hopefully it works now. And there we go. Sales, customers. Hey, there we go. So we now have our dev 18 customer in our test 18 container. So I thought that was pretty cool. Now, with that said, let's go back here. So these are the steps that I performed to do that. Now, with all that said, it does technically work, but I think the recommendation is to try to avoid doing this, because by the time you're having to do this, it means you've made several mistakes in relying upon your Docker containers. You didn't have backups, you didn't have an external SQL server, you hadn't converted your containers to images, whatever the alternatives are. So don't do this. But in a pinch, if a Docker container is messed up and it won't load, even if it's current, maybe it's a brand new Docker container and something wacky happened and it stopped working, you could still try this to pull your data out. But so I don't keep Docker containers around for months or weeks. Every single day, my Docker containers are wiped and recreated. And so there are valid cases where I want to have a bunch of data. I want to have a bunch of configuration options. I want to simulate a customer environment. So I'm looking into this. I just posted this on Twitter. What are the best alternatives for that? Let's say a customer has all sorts of unique configurations and you want to simulate that in a container. You don't want to have to do that manually. You want to automate it. So do you use test code units, use packages, integrations for test data, automation API? I'm not sure what the best answer is for that. It probably varies. Eric Hugard has a very cool tool called BCCL, BC Command Line, that essentially allows you to have command line fully scripted data imports, and you can hit specific tables. Similar to configuration packages, but totally command line, and you script out, take this CSV, push it in this data, validate, don't validate, whatever the case is, all sorts of options. So I'm going to, oh, I misspelled his name. Hold up. Let me fix that. Hugard? Okay, did that fix it? Yes. So I'm going to look into that for loading configuration data or configuration and sample data to see if that's something that I can use to reproduce scenarios. And let's say a customer has dimensions. They have certain configuration options in their receivables and sales and payables. And like in the Dynamics GP world, that was a nightmare because we didn't have a good way to reproduce that. And so partners would often get a copy of a customer's database, which is never ideal. That freaks me out. I do not want a copy of the customer's data on any of my servers. So being able to script out all the configuration options that would mimic a customer environment accurately would be super valuable, I think. And maybe I'll ask Eric if there's a way where I can easily extract it from customer environment A and use those same tables or data that's exported to push it into my Docker container B. So that would be an interesting exercise. So don't rely upon BC Docker containers for configuration or data. I think that's the base issue. Alternatives, as I mentioned, you can point containers to a local SQL instance. I'd rather not rely upon that personally. I've been dealing with local instances and Hyper-V virtual machines for years and I'm just sick of them. I want everything disposable. And if I'm out on my laptop, I want to be able to quickly and easily reproduce an environment. You could create an image from an existing container. That's an alternative. And are there other options that people use? So anyway, just questions that I have. So try to avoid using this. But in a pinch, if one of your containers just dies and won't start up, which if you've been using Docker with Business Central containers, it just happens. If you haven't had it happen to you, your days are numbered, and just be prepared for it because that day is coming, trust me. So anyway, I hope that was interesting and something to think about. If you have any other thoughts or interesting ways to deal with these issues, comment below and let me know. Okay, have a good one.